Welcome back to Tech Fresh City, and today we're going to go over graphics cards. You can see them right here. These are all used, and recently on a used PC parts hunt, I picked up 6 of these for a ridiculously good price. In fact, there was one GPU here, the RX 60. That is the name of the game, flexibility. Hopefully that card still works. We'll test it pretty soon. But we got right here an RX 6600 for under a third of MSRP. However, I know 100% because the guy told me that this was from a crypto miner. And I still took it upon myself to buy this GPU because I checked the card out and I followed a protocol to make sure I did not get hosed down. And in today's video, we are going to go through 6 of these graphics cards and talk about the methods you can use to make sure you get a really good deal on a used graphics card in 2022 and 2023, because that's just around the corner. If you want to get yourself a cheap, legit Windows 10 Pro Key license, then today's video sponsor SCD Keys has you covered. For as little as $14, when you use that coupon code BFTYC, you can get Windows activated right now. Links in the description below. So the first thing you should do when buying a used graphics card, even if it's off a gamer, is as soon as you get this card in your hands at your home or at your office or wherever it may be, you need to test the graphics card out and not just boot it to the BIOS screen. You need to install the drivers. This is super important because sometimes a lot of cards will actually be faulty once you install the driver, and it'll actually give you out an error code in Windows 10 or 11, for example. So what we're going to do right now with these 6 GPUs is we are going to run them in a quick test just to make sure that they work. Since when I bought them locally here, they were all listed, or I was told they were all working perfectly. So let's go through and run through these GPUs and see if there's any issues. So out of all these 6 GPUs, unfortunately, one of them is a fake. He's a phony. He does not belong in a gaming PC, and that's because it's faulty. And this is the GTX 950. Now, I'm not too devastated about this one in particular. The 5 graphics cards that I bought individually off separate deals, they actually all worked out fine. In fact, they were the more expensive cards of the bunch. The GTX 1070, 1650 Super, 2 1660 Supers, and also an RX 6600. But this 950, I actually got this in a used PC that I picked up for under 50 USD for the whole PC. And so I also got an i7 2600, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and a power supply and a motherboard, for instance, with that deal. So even though this GPU is faulty, I'm not too devastated. I didn't get too hosed down, even though the seller did say that the whole system worked and they gave you the usual rundown of I've tested it out, it works absolutely fine. But this graphics card is not absolutely fine. In fact, what we saw here was not just did it give us out an error message in Windows, but it also gave us these lines through the screen. Now, these lines can be caused by either of 2 things. Usually it's VRAM issues, but it can also be the GPU core clock as well. But usually these lines that we're seeing in this particular instance is actually the VRAM. So in other words, this card may have been used for crypto mining, believe it or not, a GTX 950 for some, what they call them, altcoins or crap coins. And then it just went toast and the seller decided to get rid of it, which I'm a little bit disappointed because they did say everything was working fine. But if I had bought this separately and I had paid, say for instance, the same price that I paid for that whole PC, around $50 US, I would definitely be going to get a refund on this. And so what we're going to do right now is we're going to quickly, now that we know that 5 of the graphics cards out of 6 work fine, I'm actually going to quickly clean these cards up, and then we'll get on to the second thing to make sure if you're buying a used graphics card that you don't get hosed. And it's actually important that we clean these GPUs because this is part of the second method. So we've now just taken the coolers off all these 5 GPUs, and some of them have different issues to the other coolers and GPUs. And that is, the first thing we're noticing here is that the memory pads on the VRAM, for instance, on this 1070, they've crumbled. And so when these pads crumble, they're effectively not doing their job anymore. And so it's important to not just change this thermal paste over, but it's important to change these pads over, because if they're not cooling properly, then that will lead to a failure sooner than later. So we're going to change the memory pads on this GTX 1070, for example, but when it came to pulling off the VRM thermal pads, they're actually still in good condition and they were still able to come off relatively easy, meaning that they didn't sustain as much heat problems as the VRAM did. So you can micromanage in terms of saving a little bit of money. And if both are still in good tact, well, that's a great thing. You won't really have to change the memory pads at all. But here we've got to change the memory pads on the VRAM. Then for the cards that were mined on, the GTX 1660 Supers, both of those, the VRAM memory pads were actually very brittle, and we're gonna have to replace those. And then for the RX 6600, it was actually the VRAM. And also for the GTX 1650 Super, it had the same problem as the 1660 Super, and that was the VRAM memory pad was also brittle on this GPU as well. And then the final GPU, the RX 6600, that actually had the VRAM pads, 2 of them were actually very brittle. That was the thin ones. So what we're gonna do is clean all these GPUs down now, and then we'll put those memory pads back on. But also another thing with memory pads is you've generally got 3 different options, and that is 0.5 mil, 1 mil, and 2 mil. So in this case, we're gonna need 0.5 mil pads as well as 2 mil pads, because they were the thicknesses that came off these GPUs in general. And to tell which one's which, generally the real thick ones are the 2 mil, really thin is 5.5 mil, and then the standard ones are 1 mil. Though if you are cleaning out a particular GPU and you want to know the size of the memory pads, you should be able to tell when you pull the GPU apart. If that's not enough and you don't feel safe just eyeballing it, then there should be some information on the manufacturer's website. So now we've cleaned all these graphics cards up and they're looking brand new. We've replaced the necessary thermal pads that needed to be replaced. It's time for step number 2, where we're going to check with MSI Afterburner installed, not just the temperatures, which should be a lot better than they were before, but also we're testing the headroom on the memory slider as well as the core clock slider. And this is very important to see how much we have left in terms of wiggle room from the default settings. And so basically, if we don't have really any headroom and that the sliders can't move that far before they crash, it may indicate that the GPU doesn't have a whole lot of life left. But also if you're putting it in a gaming PC, whether it's for yourself or you're reflipping a PC with one of these cards in it, It's important to know this figure because if it doesn't have a whole lot of headroom left, then it may not work for that much longer. And this is really important for step number 3, but we'll check out these values first and see if we've got any real borderline cards out of these 5. Woo! So now we've gone through all of those graphics cards. They have a healthy amount of room on both the core clock and the memory clocks, as we saw with all the NVIDIA cards. I usually like to check with a plus 100 megahertz and plus 150 is usually pretty good on air coolers. And then on the memory, plus 500. Then for the AMD card, because it's an RX 6600, we maxed the memory slider and we managed to max the core clock slider, and it still worked beautifully. Meaning these graphics cards, the 5 of them that we got in the deals hunt, they all represent phenomenal value for money now that they're cleaned up and they have a good amount of life left in them. However, if I did come into a bad card this time around, I mean, the GTX 950, that's a different scenario altogether. That was a whole PC package and I didn't really get too hosed on that one. It was like a mini hosing. I still got pretty much fair value, as we'll find out in a future video when I do take that junk PC and I turn it into a gaming PC by replacing some of those bad parts. But the 5 GPUs, they all work phenomenally well. And because we got the deals locally, if we came into a bad graphics card, then we wouldn't really have much recourse there because the graphics card works. That's the main thing. We're buying a card. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, I can't really go back to the seller on a local deal and say, hey, mate, I don't have enough headroom on the memory core clock slider or the GPU core slider. They're gonna come back and say to me, mate, tough luck. I sold it working, it was working. So that's, I guess, one disadvantage about buying a graphics card locally versus, say, online. However, I did manage to get a much, and I mean much better deals on all these cards than their prices on eBay, for example, where I'm getting some of these deals roughly at half the price I'd get them on eBay for. However, that said, if we did get a card off eBay and it had just no room on the memory slider, for example, then I would actually return that card because I feel like it doesn't have a whole lot of life left. Or if I'm selling it at a gaming PC, it's pretty much going to be problematic for the person buying it off me. So that's the difference between local and online. Much better prices locally, but at least if you buy online, make sure you've got some kind of recourse where you can get a return if the graphics card either doesn't work or it's just got horrible headroom on those sliders. Now you'll notice with a lot of the testing I did, I also put the fan speeds up to 100%, especially on the single fan edition cards. And actually with those single fan edition cards, I'm going to be, mainly when I go to sell them in gaming PCs, I'm actually going to undervolt them and have that option locked in from the get-go and tell the person, look, you're going to be saving power, card's going to be running quieter and cooler, and it's going to be better for those single fan cards because they're not the best in terms of their temperatures. And so in the long run, temperatures is what definitely destroys PC parts. Don't forget that. And so my goal now with these cards is to make sure that they're going to keep working, and whoever buys a gaming PC off me with one of these GPUs is not only going to get a really good deal, but they're also going to get a PC that's going to last for a long time. Though what we just touched on there with online versus local, there are a few key differences here. First thing is, if you're buying online, make sure you've got that return policy. Make sure you have that guarantee. So if the card doesn't work or if it's borderline working, you can simply get a refund. Then when it comes to getting a deal locally, I usually try to see the card working or proof that it works. And so if I get one of those two conditions satisfied, then I'm usually pretty happy, and I know there's a very small chance that that person is going to try and scam me, aka hose me down. However, when it comes to picking up deals locally, there's also another layer of protection that I like to put on, and that is I like to meet someone either at their house or at their place of work. And this is mainly due to the fact that if I meet someone at a public place, they can just simply hose me down very easily. And in fact, over 5 years ago, when I first came back to Australia and picked up a GPU deal, it was actually 2 GPUs, And so that person met me at the gas station and they gave me all that run through jazz. Don't worry, mate, these cards work perfectly fine. And then when I got home, one of the cards was just completely faulty. Messaged the guy and he just ghosted me and then blocked me. And I never heard from him again. I just was out of $60 US. I had a faulty graphics card and there was no recourse. I didn't know how to get a hold of this guy. If I went to the police, they would just look at $60 US in Australia and just laugh. It's not worth their time. So for me, after that, I learned to always meet someone either at their house or at their place of work. And since then, out of all those deals that I've picked up in the past, I've only ever been hosed, and I didn't get hosed once. And so what happened was I bought a graphics card. Person said, oh, it works fine. I said, okay, can I see it working? They're like, nah, mate, if it doesn't work, just come back. So I got the card, paid for it, got home, tested it straight away. It didn't work. It just flat out didn't work. So what I did was then I messaged them and said, hey mate, this card doesn't work. You said it worked. I want a refund. And then they gave me this whole story about it was working when I last tested it. And that's what you're going to hear a lot of the times. It was working when I last tested it. And that's a very common excuse from someone that knows the part doesn't work and they're trying to play it off as it does work. Either the card works or it doesn't work. It's that simple. Never forget when you're picking up a deal locally, when they tell you it was working when I last tested it, it's a very common excuse for something that doesn't work. So if that's the case, make sure you know you can get some kind of recourse. And so for me, I just rocked up at their door, started knocking on the door. I was pretty furious and I got my money back. So that was that. And with those tips and tricks out of the way when it comes to getting GPU bargains, don't be afraid to go hit up the used market with all this information in hand, because you are going to get an absolute bargain and you're going to get some of the best price performance that PC gaming has to offer from the used market. And now in terms of what I did here today, I'll put some links in the description below for some of the gear that I use to clean up these parts and make them look brand new. For instance, I use a thing called multi-purpose spray. It is my go-to product for making the parts not only a lot cleaner. In the case of that RX 6600, we managed to get that fan working, that 1660 Super. That fan started working perfectly again, and there's no rattling noises or anything like that. But also, it makes the card look like brand new after it's done cleaning out all the dust. Now you probably also saw I was using the Data Vac. That's an electric air blower that does a fantastic job of cleaning down PC parts. So there are cheaper alternatives out there, so I'll also put something like that in the links in the description below so you can check that out. So between those two things, cleaning shouldn't be too much of a problem. Also for GPU thermal pads, I'll put some links for those. They're very cheap. You usually want to carry, if you're constantly changing thermal pads and thermal paste, you'll want to get some GD900 thermal paste. Super cheap, super effective, and also a set of 2, 1, and 0.5 mil thermal pads. Though if you thought that was it, then it's not. I've also got one final tip, and that is if you're buying a GPU nowadays, you have to be careful, and this is what I said in a previous video, have to be careful of GPUs that have gone through what I call 2 rounds or 2 seasons of crypto mining. These are the RX 400 and 500 series GPUs, and there's also the GTX 10 series cards now. So when you're buying those particular GPUs, make sure, I would be personally buying them off a gamer rather than a miner, because if they've gone through 2 seasons of mining, most likely the VRAM has had a very tough life, and those GPUs probably won't have a whole lot of life left in them. Even if the cryptocurrency miner who you're buying them off has done undervolting, has taken care of the cards, just because of the sheer length that they've been mined on, they will be, in my opinion, pretty due for the scrapper anytime soon. So I'm being very careful when I buy those 2 types of GPU families. Also, if you're buying off a crypto miner, you may wish to ask them if they optimize the cards. And the reason I say optimized is because I want to hear their response. If they then come back and said, yep, I undervolted the cards, made sure they weren't running that hot, then there's a good chance I'm going to get a good card from them with good life left. And so that's a lot of good, because the price is also going to be good too. However, if they come back and say, oh no, I just left them on default settings, I just left them run out of the box, I'm going to be very careful and probably going to want to see live proof that that GPU is working on the spot before I take it. So that's also another tip. And with that aside, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video on buying a used graphics card after this second crypto bust. And also, if you guys have any questions or comments, be sure to drop a comment in the comment section below. Love reading those thoughts and opinions as always. And also, if you've got some tips and tricks for fellow PC gamers to get a bargain, do drop your comment in the comment section below. Love reading as always. Just like this question of the day here, I promised I was bringing it back. And this comes from For Real. So I'm guessing he's double for real. And they ask, I know you make your money also with YouTube content and placements, but if the prices tank this hard, also PC builder, resellers, flippers like you must also lose a lot of revenue, or is this not the case? So this is a great question because depending on which PC seller you ask, you'll probably get a different answer. For me personally, I've always, and I said this before I left to Japan over 6 months ago, I said one thing that I was doing, actually pretty sure I said this over a year ago, was I was really tightening down on my turnover, and that I was flipping builds as fast as I could because I didn't want to be sitting on the same season of pricing. In that last year, for example, 1080 Ti's were going locally here for over 500 Aussie dollars. Now a 1080 Ti can be pretty much had for around 250 Aussie dollars. So that's a drop of pretty much half the price of what it was for last year. And so if I bought that last year and I was still sitting on that, there's no way I'm going to be able to flip that in a PC and remain competitive. So it's important, if you're a PC flipper going forward, in my opinion, to definitely be on high turnover. And that means generally making lower profit margins. And so going forward, I've actually already sold a couple of PCs since I've been back, and I'm lining up more sales, but that's because I'm being super competitive, very tight with my pricing, and that's just the way the market is going right now. There's a thing called quantitative tightening. The central banks pretty much all around the world right now are conducting quantitative tightening, aka they're taking money out of the system. And so when money's getting tighter, that means prices will naturally come down, especially on your non-essentials like a PC gaming graphics card. Hope that answers that question. And if you've stayed this far and you're enjoying that Tech Yes content, be sure to hit that sub button, ring that bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out for now. Bye.